My talk today is going to be brief. It's in the meaning of the words. And I'm going to be talking mostly from the perspective of a teacher educator who works with non-native speakers. And what is the vision, my vision for a world that is more welcoming and more united from the point of view of somebody who trains or educates future educators. I feel I have a great responsibility, as do all teacher educators, towards not directly our trainees, but the students that they teach, who are invisible to us most of the times. And if we really want to make an impact in the world, and we want to make the world a true place of common understanding where differences are minimized and likenesses are maximized, we need to look at how we can teach culture. Most of my trainees are non-native speakers, about 98%, and most of them come from underprivileged backgrounds. They've never been abroad, so what they hold about the culture of English-speaking countries are many times idealized versions that they get either through the movies or that they get through the course books that they study. And of course, they are enamored of the native speaker phenomenon, that person who owns the language simply for the fact of having been born in a country where the language is spoken and being brought up in that country. I struggle because when I have native speakers in the classroom, my non-native speaker students generally tend to shy away from showing off their true colors, and they tend to imitate what the native speaker does. And they tend to pick up ways of behaving which are not in sync with what their students in the classroom expect. So I always ask them to do a little exercise at the beginning of the course. I ask them to go into Google Images and look for an icon or image to represent the native speaker. And this is what you get. This is the most frequent Google image for native speaker. Then I ask them to do exactly the same thing for non-native speaker. And can we move on to the next slide? There are no images for non-native speaker, which means that somehow what they are receiving is the message that a non-native speaker is not as worthy as a native speaker. And as our dear colleague Savannah Richardson said in her brilliant EFL plenary in 2016, 80% of the people teaching English in the world nowadays are non-native speakers. So I refuse to categorize the majority of the people in my profession as a non. So what do we do? Well, the first thing that I try to instill in my students in my student teachers, is the fact that whenever we are dealing with language, we're necessarily dealing with culture. Can we move on to the next slide, please? If we want to live in a world that actually is welcoming of all diversity and caters for the needs of all its citizens, we need to do away with different biases. And we need to look at how what we generally understand as the culture of the countries is not something that is monolithic and can be written in stone. Like, for example, the culture of the English-speaking countries. Can you imagine what that means? Culture of all the English-speaking countries is the culture, for example, of Jamaica, the same as the culture of Canada or the United States, New Zealand, Australia. And within those countries, can we talk about a culture of the country? How about the cultures of the regions? And the same thing happens with our students, right? Can we move on to the next slide, please? So my vision for the future is that through language teaching, we can actually create a world of proximities instead of distances. There's a wonderful little online video by Garza where he has this amazing quote that learning the culture of the language does not only allow us to be competent in that language, that is to say, to manage the words correctly, it allows us to be proficient in it. Whenever we talk about anything in a language, we are promoting a particular way of looking at the world through the language. Having heard Marcelo, I always refer to this wonderful word in Portuguese, which is saudade, which has no translation into any language. We could say saudade is a longing for something. It's being a little bit melancholic about something, but it's not the same. By the same token, the word home means different things to different people. So what can I do as a teacher educator to help my students see beyond? Can we move on to the next slide, please? This knowing about. What they receive through their training is mostly cultural information. Even the best well-intended courses in culture focus on providing a lot of information and knowing about the culture. So students are expected to know about George Washington or Winston Churchill, and these are all facts. Now they're supposed to know what the 5th of November means for British people, what the 4th of July means for Americans, and they have the facts. Now, to truly understand what happens on the 4th of July, why people go on picnics on the 4th of July, particularly for somebody in the Southern Hemisphere, where the 4th of July is a bitter, cold part of the year. And people in the States go on picnics and they celebrate with fireworks. They need to have access to other things. So, as Claire Crunch reminds us, next slide, please. We have to move beyond food, folklore, and festivals, right? Which is what most materials for language teaching focus on. And we need to move from knowing about the culture to, next slide, knowing how things happen. Why are there certain cultural practices that are adhered to by a certain population? We need to also know why, what perspectives those peoples have. And more importantly, and this is to me the most important knowing, is the knowing of oneself. Where do I stand? Where does my culture stand? And that of my students, of course, in contrast with the culture of this country whose language I'm teaching. And this knowing oneself means the self-awareness of my beliefs, my opinions, my values, feelings, how I question things, how I react, how I think, and how ideas develop. And not only myself as a teacher, but how does the cultural information I share with my students impact their own set of beliefs, opinions, values, etc. One of the areas of second language acquisition that is very well discussed about is students' perception of themselves as speakers in terms of what we call their funds of knowledge. The fund of knowledge of a person is all the knowledge that they accrue from being socialized into a family, a community, a city, etc. Those funds of knowledge sometimes act against our students' best learning efforts. For example, I hear it a lot in my class, well, I cannot learn English because my father tried and he was unsuccessful. So, it's in the genes. And we know that is not true. So the way we approach culture is using the ideas of Pat Moran that I have just shared, of the 4 domains of knowledge about culture, and also the work of Fantini and Fantini in 1997, a beautiful TESOL book called New Ways in Teaching Literature. And there, Fantini and Fantini propose that what we work with most frequently in terms of culture are the cultural artifacts: books, music, food, laws, etc. Now we need to look at the sociofacts as well, which is those books, music, foods, and laws are created because of certain social interaction patterns. And there are also mentifacts: attitudes, values, ideas, and meaning. And as you can see, the three elements interact. What we do whenever we find one of those critical cultural incidents, as we call them, when they say, oh yeah, because in the States, everybody drives a car. And you go like, are you sure everybody does? Right? We need to question it. That would be the artifact, right? The information. Next slide, please. We need to look at it in relation to our own lived experience. In my country, it's not common for everybody to own a car or two cars, let alone three, right? Like it would be in the States. So my future teachers begin exploring one of those assumptions in terms not only of the artifact that generated it, but also what are the social interaction patterns and rules that dominate that kind of artifact and the mentifact. And then, just to conclude, what I start my course, every single course with, is a quotation that I require that my students have with them all the time as a little card. And whenever they are doing something, they face one of those critical moments in teaching, they resort to it. Can we move on? And this is this wonderful quote from Paulo Freire in the book Letters to Christina, who was his niece. He wrote in 1996. He says that whenever we do something, we need to think about who do I serve doing what I do, against whom or in favor of whom, and what do I do what I do. So my dear colleagues, this is the message I wanted to convey. A world of proximities and not of distances. Our colleagues in Puerto Rico and the people of Puerto Rico were very badly hit. They need us, so please consider donating. I want to thank everybody for attending, the organizers for doing this amazing job, and I look forward to reaching our target today.